Today, we're diving into the mind of Ram Manohar Lohia. He was one of the most original and, frankly, rebellious thinkers in modern Indian history. A socialist who wasn't afraid to challenge pretty much everyone, from capitalists to communists and even his own allies.
So let's kick things off with a pretty radical question, one that was really at the heart of everything Lohia thought about. What if capitalism and communism, the two great enemies of the 20th century, what if they were actually just two different roads leading to the same exact place? A place with a centralized, industrial society that kind of crushes the individual. Lohia was convinced they were, and he spent his entire life trying to find the third way.
And that search is exactly what led him to try and forge a uniquely Indian path, a totally new kind of socialism that wasn't designed for Europe, but for the villages and the real-life situation of a nation just emerging from colonialism.
So who was this guy? Well, Ram Manohar Lohia, born in 1910, wasn't just some academic philosopher. He was a freedom fighter, right there on the front lines, and a founder of the Congress Socialist Party. But here's the crucial part. He got his PhD in Berlin. Think about that. He was in Germany, watching the rise of Nazism with his own eyes. That experience gave him this deep, deep skepticism of all Western ideologies and sent him home totally determined to create a socialism that was genuinely Indian.
In this quote, this just captures his core idea perfectly. He looked at the two biggest forces in India at the time, Marxism and Gandhism, and he saw them both as incomplete, as one-armed. He argued that to build a truly just society, you needed to combine them. You needed the Marxist focus on economic equality, but it had to be guided by Gandhi's principles of nonviolence and decentralization. It was a pretty radical idea, trying to blend the two.
But before you can build a new world, you have to diagnose what's wrong with the old one. And Lohia was without a doubt one of the sharpest critics of post-independence India.
His first major target was the orthodox Marxists. He basically told them, look, your obsession with class is a European import, and it just doesn't fit the reality of India. He argued that in India, the main system of oppression wasn't a fluid economic class you could move in and out of. Nope, it was the rigid, unchangeable hierarchy of caste you were born into.
This line right here just nails his insight. Caste is a stagnant class. For Lohia, caste was a form of class you could never, ever escape. He believed that any talk about class struggle in India was a complete fantasy if you didn't first confront the brutal reality of caste.
He also went after the new government's economic policies. He famously kicked off the Three Anna debate in Parliament. He pointed out the hypocrisy of politicians living these lavish lifestyles while the average Indian, he claimed, was surviving on just 3 annas a day. That's an amount that could barely even buy you a cup of tea back then. It was a huge wake-up call about the gap between what the elite were saying and how the masses were actually living.
And his final critique was cultural. His Angrezi Hatao, or Remove English movement, is so often misunderstood. He wasn't anti-English. He was anti-elitism. He argued that when your laws, your courts, and your entire government operates in a language that only 1% of the people speak, well, you don't really have a democracy. What you have is a system that locks out the vast majority of your own citizens.
Okay, so after all that criticism, what was his actual plan? What was his solution? Well, this brings us to his blueprint for what he called a new socialism.
At the very heart of his vision was the Sapt Kranti, or the 7 revolutions. And this is so important. This wasn't just about economics. For Lohia, a real revolution had to attack all forms of injustice at the same time, from gender and caste inequality at home to colonialism abroad. His framework was so holistic, it even included protecting individual privacy from the state and calling for a world without weapons.
So what about politics? He proposed the Chaukhamba Raj, or the 4-pillar state. He was deeply, deeply suspicious of centralized power just sitting in New Delhi, so his solution was radical decentralization. He wanted to distribute power equally among the village, the district, the province, and the center. In his ideal world, a village council would have just as much power in its own sphere as the parliament in Delhi.
So when you put all these pieces together, what you get is what he called socialist humanism. Unlike the Soviet model, which basically treated people like cogs in a giant state machine, Lohia's socialism was fiercely democratic. He believed the ultimate goal of any system had to be the dignity, the freedom, and even the privacy of the individual.
So it's a grand vision for sure. But how do you actually make it happen? How do you get from theory to action? Well, Lohia was a practical man, and he gave people a clear toolkit for how to get it done.
He called it the triple method. First, the spade,
which stands for constructive work, literally going out and building schools, digging wells, building society from the ground up. Then the vote, for democratic politics, organizing, fighting elections. And finally, jail, being willing to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience, in satyagraha, and face prison for what you believe in. For him, you needed all three.
And on the economic front, his tool was the small unit machine. He basically rejected the two extremes he saw: Gandhi's spinning wheel, which he thought was too primitive, and Nehru's giant megafactories, which he felt were too dehumanizing. He imagined a middle path: small, low-cost, power-driven machines that could actually be used in villages to create tons of jobs without forcing everyone to move to city slums.
And this right here, this gets to the absolute core of his thinking. Whether it was politics or technology, Lohia's entire philosophy was built on the scale of the human. He believed small was beautiful because small was controllable. Small dams, small machines, small government structures, these things keep power in the hands of ordinary people and stop a giant faceless bureaucracy from taking over.
So, why does any of this matter today? Well, Lohia's ideas didn't just stay in books. They actually went on to fundamentally reshape Indian politics.
This led him to his most explosive political idea, captured in a slogan: Pichda Pave Sal Mein Esat. The backward should get 60 out of 100. He argued that for groups that have been oppressed for centuries, and this included Dalits, women, and minorities, just having equal opportunity was not enough. To achieve true equality, he said they needed preferential treatment, a 60% reservation in positions of power and in jobs.
And this idea became his most powerful legacy. It literally laid the intellectual groundwork for the rise of OBC, other backward class, politics, and the whole social justice movement that completely transformed North Indian democracy from the 1980s onward. It empowered millions of people who had been locked out of power for generations.
Which brings us to a final thought. Ram Manohar Lohia was a rebel who challenged the giants of his time. But when you look at our world today, dominated by massive corporations, centralized states, and incredibly complex technologies, you have to ask, was his vision of a decentralized, human-scale society just a forgotten dream? Or was it a prophetic blueprint for the future? That's something worth thinking about.